Get started. All right, excellent. So thank you all for joining. So first let's start with some, I won't call them icebreakers, if you will, but perhaps everyone. So if you all know how to raise up your hand in Zoom, I know a lot of people use Teams and stuff like that. So it may appear on the bottom or the top, but if you go in with, it's going to be, where's it going to be? I'm seeing it from a different screen. Sorry, because I'm in the share mode. But it should be within, not chat, it's the
reactions.
I think it's in the more. Yeah, reactions. So you can raise your hand if you have any questions, but this is a very informal setting. So please feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question if you are comfortable with being on camera. So this is being recorded. So if you're not comfortable with that, please don't turn your camera on or speak. You can just put your questions in the chat. All right, so with a show of hands, can we see how many people are actually scheduled to write the RQAP-GLP, that's what the session's for, exam at the end, I think it's the end of March, start of April. So if you're sitting for the next session to write the RQAP-GLP, do you want to raise your hand just so we can get a sense of how many? All right, so I see 3 hands, excellent. Okay, great. And how about if you're not quite registered to write it for the next session, but are thinking about doing it for the fall? Can you put your hands up if you're thinking about it for the fall? A lot more. Okay, so we've got 6, 7. All right, so we've got 7 that are interested in, potentially writing it this fall. So that's great. So this is a perfect opportunity to kind of check this out and see what it's about and get yourself a little bit better prepared. All right, so let me just start with the presentation. So actually, let me not, and I forgot to do this last time, so I will introduce myself. Forgot about that. I will introduce the team of subject matter experts that will be assisting with this chat. So my name is Sherry Lee Dawson. I'm a RQAP-GLP since 2004. I initially wrote in 2001. I passed it, but then back then we didn't do a whole lot of training, so I didn't get enough units to re-register, so I had to rewrite, sorry, not in 2004, 2005. So 2005 I rewrote, and then I've had it ever since. So I have lots of experience with that. I have sat on the CPR committee, which is the group that oversees the RQAP program. I'm currently an SQA board member, a director, and I've been involved in various programs. So lots of experience. So I am a little bit out of date in terms of actually writing the exam. For the most part, once you write it and pass it, then you put all the effort in to make sure you don't lose it, because it's way easier to keep it than losing it and rewriting. So I see Anita laughing, and I'm sure she completely agrees. And anyone else who's already a registered professional will understand that. So at this point, I would like to pass it over to one of our 2 subject matter experts who are joining today. We've got Anita and Camilla. So Camilla, can we start with you and give yourself a little introduction so people know who you are?
Sure, thank you. My name is Camilla Novak. I'm not working as a QA in the GLP area. I'm mostly, excuse me, compliance auditor, and I'm auditing both in GMP, GCP, and GLP area, and GCLP area, and medical labs and things like that. Sometimes it's a kind of question mark with the labs, because you may have a lab that does multiple things, and then you have non-clinical, and then you have preclinical, and then you have the typical like biomedical labs and purely GLP labs and analytical labs, which are mostly related to GMP. So sometimes it's a kind of confusion, but I'm sure that you know the differences. And also we are preparing the GCLP course, which is hopefully going to go live in the fall. So we will be talking quite a lot about those and the differences if you are interested generally in the lab work and lab areas. And I'm here happy to support. I'm happy to we revive these study groups. And by the way, as Sherry mentioned, the way of re-registration, you may collect credits that help you when you registered once and when you pass the exam, that you give you credits for the next time. And sometimes you can even make it up using the credits if you have a lot of activities. But it's so, as Anita and Sherry agree, it's easier to keep the RQAP certification or registration than lose it and then start all over again. Passing to Anita.
Hi, everyone. I'm Anita Habibi. I have been a QA since 2008, but I got my registration in 2011, and I've been lucky to be able to keep it because I don't want to take that test again. But my focus has been GLP and then also veterinary GCP, but I've been a QA since 2008. The last session was very well done with Sherry. She really, truly, I was very impressed. So I hope that you guys enjoy it as much as I did the last time.
All right, thank you. Thanks, Anita and Camilla. So yeah, this again, it's a very informal session, so there's no rules or you have to wait here or there for questions. So we do have a little bit of a PowerPoint, but it's not so much, again, this is not a training. This is more a study group. Well, that's exactly what it is. So the more you put in, the more you're going to get out of. So it's not just a sit there and passively listen, because we're not here to train you. We certainly do have some advice. So what we will do is we will go through some of the information, the topics that we're covering today. We'll offer a few tips and tricks, especially because not everyone necessarily attended all sessions, but just some things to keep in mind when you are writing the exam, things to prepare for, what to expect, and that kind of thing. And then we actually do have 5 test questions, studying test questions. These ones will not officially be on the exam, but you can get a sense of what type of questions there are, what the type of answers there are. And typically you're going to see everything is multiple choice. So that's always good, but it's not necessarily easy multiple choice. So we'll jump right in. So we're on week 2 already. And so we're going to be tackling a compliance assessments, monitoring, and what to monitor. So that's what today's topic is. Oh, sorry, let me just jump back one. Next week's session. So all our sessions are on Tuesday at 1 p.m. Eastern. Next week's session is the compliance assessment, inspecting and what to inspect. The week after, compliance assessment, auditing and what to audit. Week after, applied expertise, evaluating what to evaluate. And the last one, applied expertise, advising and what to advise on. All right, so what does today's topic include? So so if you have any questions about any of what encompasses this session, feel free to raise your hand and ask your questions. At any point, if you have questions, raise your hand. Typically, you'll see as we go through the test, the sample questions, that you'll see the type of question. Then we have typically more discussion around that, and that's where we start adding some of the tips and tricks to, like, focus, really make sure you read through the question properly, because sometimes there's very slightly tricky wording in there, and you want to make sure that you've read the question correctly and that you've read all the answers correctly. Sometimes there's subtle little things in there that, like, it seems really right, except this one thing. All right, so Today's topics cover receipt, handling, storage, preparation, including mixing, analyses or administration to the test system of the test, control, and reference material, test system receipt, quarantine, randomization, allocation, identification, acclimatization, observations and disposition, specimen and or sample collection, labeling, storage, shipping, receiving, handling, and or disposition, specimen and or sample analyses, reagent and supply shipping, receiving, handling, storage, and disposition. Adherence of procedures specified in the protocol, SOPs, and applicable company policies, data collection processes and data integrity, manual and automated, equipment, maintenance, calibration, and validation, archive of test article, facility, and study materials, including disaster recovery and the appropriateness of raw data for archival, storage, retrieval, and disposition. And lastly, laboratory, facility, and or site activities that support GLP studies. So those are the topics that fall under this section of monitoring what to monitor. All this information does come from your guide on writing the RQAP. So if you go to the SQA.org website and go to the RQAP, there is a booklet that you can access that shows you all this material. So this isn't anything that I've pulled out of my brain. I'm going to see if I can open that first. I'll get that to you guys and just to show you where that is. And so there's a lot of information, and it also highlights which how much percentage of exam questions are going to be on the different topics. Let me just. All right, so we're at SQA under education and career to get the RQAP information. And if you're interested in,
Yeah, we don't see your other screen, Sherry.
Okay, let me just stop sharing. Oh, because it's probably the. Sorry, let me just do this for a second. Can you see it now?
Yes, we do.
Okay, perfect. Thank you for pointing that out. I think it's just sharing one item at a time. So if you go to SQA under education and career, you've got the RQAP credential. And if you scroll down, it talks about information about it, the registry, the overview, all that fun stuff. But if you continue to scroll down, if we go to the GLP, and we have the candidate handbook. So if you go through that, I'm not going to take all the time to go through that, but if you scroll down, it has all kinds of information about the exam itself. But then it does have a listed information about the GLP exam, and then subsequently has the information for the GCP. So what's covered in that. So it has the different topics and what percentage of the overall exam types of questions are geared towards the different areas. Okay. So that's where that is. Can you still see my presentation now? Okay, perfect. All right, so that's the topics for today. So at this point, does anybody have any questions? If not, I think we'll just dive into some of the sample questions and then sort of elaborate on that, or actually maybe perhaps we'll give you a few pointers first and then we'll jump into it. So one of the things that you definitely want to remember if you are writing the exam or preparing to write the exam, read through all the material that is posted. So all that information is there. It is important to read through it and know it, but you don't have to have it memorized. So there's not going to be any questions about like what point of the FDA GLP stipulate to do that. So you're not required to remember that it's 58.95 B3. So don't stress about that. If you're great with remembering sections, my hat's off to you, but the questions are not that specific. Most of them are going to be situations, And what you're looking for is the most compliant based on the wording of the regulations. So what this means is that how your company may actually implement practices on that, that may not be the right answer. So it doesn't mean to say that your company's practices are wrong, but it just means that they're looking for the most correct answer and thinking from a very conservative approach. Now, we know the regulations, if you've been working in the regulations for a little while now, you know there's a lot of gray area. There's a lot of different ways to meet the regulatory requirements. But when you're writing this exam, think, if I was an FDA inspector, what are they expecting? Not necessarily what does your company do or what's your interpretation of it. What would that FDA inspector be looking for? You do have to know the OECD principles of GLP as well. We had a question last session concerning whether you need to know all the content of, because if you're familiar with the OECDs, there's document 1, which is the principles of GLP, the main basis of the main rules that most countries have adopted into regulations. But then there are documents 2 to 24. I recommend reading through them, but you're not required to, again, remember them verbatim. OECD works a little bit differently in that they more actively issue and implement advisory documents, consensus documents, and all these additional numbers after the 1 to elaborate expectations and modernize, if you will, document 1, whereas the FDA GLPs, they have to hash that out and take it through various levels of government. So that's why I'm sure you all have heard that the GLPs are in the process of being revised. They will be, it's coming. But with OECD, it is easier because they just keep elaborating on it or enhancing their interpretations versus actually going back and rechanging. So.
Sure, there's a question.
Yes.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say there's a question over there already posted if you want to.
Oh,
it says,
yes.
Will there be multiple select questions as well?
There are 2 types of questions. One, like select only one answer. And then out of all of them, only one is the one considered really the most correct. And then you do have multiple correct answers, but it's posted in a different way. It's like 1, 2, and 4, or it's 1, 3, and 5. So you get the possible selections, and you need to choose the option with the selections that are most accurate. So that's how it works. You are not supposed to mark separate questions that you think, but you get the options offered.
Thank you. That's correct. So great question. So there are some, I don't know if it's this session, there's definitely a couple that are in our sample, and the sample the whole sample 30 questions is available on the SQA site. If you go to the RQAP there, you can link on it and take it and just practice. The exam itself is, I believe it's 150 questions. Maybe 150 or 180, sorry. I don't quote me on that, but there's quite a number of questions, and the amount of time is, I believe it's about, you get 3 hours maximum to do it. So there's a lot of questions, and what seems like not a lot of time once you start going into it. So another key thing as you're writing the exam, if you're read through the question, take your time. Again, take the extra time to read through it clearly, because that will be a difference between, oh, I misread it and selected the wrong one. Take your time to read through it. But if you have to think about it too much, put a little asterisk beside it and move on. It's better to get through all of the quiz questions and then come back to the ones that you weren't certain versus potentially getting stuck on one and taking 5, 10, 15, 20. The time does pass, especially as you're looking at a question and trying to like figure, would it be this or not sure. If you're not sure, it's safer to jump over it, because worst case scenario, you skip one and you don't get one responded to versus taking too long and you missing like 10 at the end. So it is a bit of a numbers game when you're writing it. All
Yeah,
right.
you
So
put a timer, so you will see what time is remaining. And there is also an easy way to see everything you flagged at the end, because you see everything and then you are prompted to submit. So you are like complete and then confirmation. So you have the time after you think you are complete to go back to any question you want, either you flagged to get back to or you left unanswered. But don't try to rethink the questions way too much, because most of the time we tend to make mistakes on the second attempt to answer, thinking, no, maybe this is this one. Our instincts and experience are usually driving us to the correct one. So if you think about it and start analyzing it way too much, it might be worse than for better.
absolutely. You can totally talk yourself out of the right answer. All right, so let's jump into some of the quiz questions. So the first one, a study protocol requires body weights to be determined twice each week. 2 technicians work together. A technician weighs the animals and another technician records the weights on the data forms. The study director observes the process. Who should be identified on data sheets? Select one. A, technician who weighs the animals only. B, both technicians. C, technician who records weights only. D, the study director. So let me know what you think in the chat. And excellent, people are already responding.
Overwhelming number of B's.
So lots of B's, B's. Anything other than a B? All right, so verified by study director and last. All right, so the answer is B. So great job, everyone. And that comes from 21 CFR Part 58 130E. All data generated during the conduct of a non-clinical laboratory study, except those that are generated by automated data collection systems, shall be recorded directly, promptly, and legibly in ink. All data entry shall be dated on the date of entry and signed or initialed by the person entering the data. And it goes on to talk about the electronic system. So the expectation is obviously anyone who's doing something, it needs to be indicated that that person's done something, with the exception of observing. Typically, though, most companies will have study director sign off that they've observed, but they're not signing that they conducted the activity. So a lot of people will have some sort of logbook or somewhere where the study director will write off that, observed dosing, because that is something regulators do want to make sure that study directors are in there and, performing their single point of control functionality of, being on top of what's going on and stuff like that. So study director, of course, is also responsible for the data on their study. So, but you want to make sure that both technicians sign the data. And if it's being documented electronically or on a form, it should be clear about who did what. So if there's one technician doing the activity and someone's just the recorder, that should be clear in your data as well. Okay, does anybody have any other options that you thought could potentially be it? And if so, what? Why?
Hi, I'm Dolores. Okay, so I selected both technicians. But this is one of those examples where if it was happening, then you might document that it happened, which means that if the study director observed it, then you would record it. But I guess it goes back to what you said about the best answer, which means obviously if the 2 technicians did it and based on the answers that are presented, that would be the best answer. So I'm just commenting that in a question like this, if the study director observes it, it seems like in your mind that because he observed it, it would be noted somewhere.
Yeah.
But I guess the best answer obviously is that the 2 technicians that actually did it. So.
Yeah. And exactly, it comes, who should be identified on the data sheets, right? So the study director should be documenting that they observed the activity, but maybe it's not on the data sheets. Maybe your process is there's a logbook. So there's always some little things that, you know, little details there in the question that you're like, you know, so study director might have been a great choice because study director is responsible for all the data. They have to make sure that the data is reviewed and verified. They're single point of control. So there's a lot of aspects of study director, and you know, people might just think, oh, study director, but again, it's the technicians that are actually performing it that need to be documenting on that data sheet, right? The data sheet is the one that's collecting it. So, but thank you, Dolores. Absolutely. That's the type of thing that, you know, it's a fairly straightforward question, but sometimes, again, especially when you're sitting down and writing a test, it can be very nerve-wracking. You're nervous, you're trying to remember all that stuff that you've gone through. And so definitely take the time to read the question well and the responses as well. Thanks for sharing.
We have a comment here in the
Yes.
chat saying we document when there is a scribe. So what if you have situation when another person is making the records and perhaps two people are involved in the activity? There are many animals. There is time limit to complete it. So both of them are weighing the animals and always say loud what they see. And then a third person is making the record. So what that would mean in terms of correct record keeping? Having 3 people?
Yeah. So all 3 would have to record. So however many are involved, anyone individually conducting an activity, and if they're part of that activity, whether they're just the scribe, the documenter, everyone has to identify what they're responsible for. Would the forms need to be set up to capture all activities? Yes, ideally you want to, your form wants to be able to prompt for that. That's the perfect world. Sometimes the expectation is that there was really only going to be one person doing body weight. Say if you only have 20 animals, but perhaps on a given day, things got really backed up. And so someone needs a little bit of help. So, you know, if that happens, that your form is not designed to capture, you still want to make sure that the staff know that they need to be documenting that. So, you know, they can do the activity, both initial date, and then put a footnote. Bob was the weigher, Mary was the scribe of the data, just to make sure that that's recorded.
I would say ideally you did this kind of assessment in the beginning when you are planning the study, as mapping it and see the processes. Here we have this. Do we have a corresponding form? Is the form fit for the purpose here to record what we need to be recorded? And forms are not engraved in stone. They are to be customized if you need. So make sure that your forms are fit for purpose for the study you have and for all its phases.
Absolutely.
I did also want to mention something, for example, in the labs when they have one computer or laptop that they're sharing. So the first person documents that I weigh the animal, log off that computer, and then the second person logs in with their credential and say that I completed the task of weighing the animals, and so on and so forth. So that's also important too. Sometimes we forget about that when we use electronic recording, when there's only one laptop is used.
Absolutely. And that is super important to remember in electronic data, that you have to be logged in under your name to document that. Absolutely. Thank you, Anita. That's a great point. All right. Yes. And thank you. Part 11 applies as well for the exam. Again, you don't need to cite the different part 11 point blah, blah, blah. I don't remember the numbers. I have my little handy regs, but I don't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but you do have to remember how it applies. All right, let's jump into another question. So the second one, a CRO So that's a contract research organization. There's a lot of acronyms in our industry. So utilizes a chromatography data software system to analyze samples and generate electronic data for test substance characterization and storage stability studies. Prior to study completion, the study director prepares a duplicate copy of all e-data onto a DVD or CD, which is audited by the QAU. The study director then deletes all electronic data from the system and archives the CD, DVD with the paper raw data at study completion. Which of the following statements is correct? Select 1. Metadata do not need to be retained with raw data. The transfer method to CD/DVD must be validated and documented according to facility SOPs and must be in a human readable format. The original e-data must be copied to DVD/CD media, but cannot be deleted from the e-system. And D, gold archival DVD/CD media must be used to copy electronic data. All right, so if we take a look, I see
So
a
we
lot of
have
Bs.
some B's and one C, if I'm not mistaken.
I'm
Yes.
seeing- yeah, there's a couple C's. All right. So the most correct answer is the transfer method to CD/DVDs must be validated and documented according to facility SOPs and must be in a human readable format.
Which includes the metadata and which includes audit trail. So all that should go to the CD or DVD. And yes, if you want to archive it, then it should have the archival quality. It's not the one I buy at the stationery to make a copy of my favorite song. That's definitely not a suitable CD or DVD for archiving. So yes, there are some standards for archival quality media, and you may need to delete the memory of the system because it's not unlimited. And if the facility is up and running for a long time, does many studies like CROs typically do for more than one client, then you may have such a huge capacity in numbers of terabytes that you cannot really handle it like keeping everything. So yes, you can do that, but you need to make sure that everything is transferred, it's on the right media, and there is one more trick, which is not mentioned here. I just mention it as a point of interest. There may be a challenge for long-term archiving, so make sure you know what is the retention period, and then there should be some activity to make sure that the DVD or CD is not only humanly readable today, but also maybe in 10 years or longer. And that's not so self-evident, that there might be some challenges and there might be needs to keep moving it to a new media and new format to make sure that you can read it one day on your current hardware and with your current software, which is a totally different version. And if you try to put some old CD with the data on your computer, if you still have a CD slot or at least an external CD drive, it will tell you that the format is not supported and cannot be read. So that's something typically the IT or the archiving company takes care of, but it's important to remember that we cannot take it for granted that the fact we can read it now means that we can read it whenever.
Absolutely. Jordy also put a comment about cloud services can be used. So more and more, I think many companies perhaps have stepped away from the CD, DVD, and they're using cloud storage to store that, and that's perfectly fine. Again, as long as you've tested and validated, verified the process, and that you have checked as well that for the duration. So just from the regulations themselves, so you have your US EPA GLPs, 40 CFR 160-195I, records required by this part may be retained either as original records or as true copies, as photocopies, microfilm, microfiche, or other accurate reproductions of the original records. So that's how a CD, DVD version would be acceptable. 40 CFR 169.2K. These records shall be retained as long as the registration is valid and the producer is in business. So again, you need to make sure that it's available. And 21 CFR Part 1110B talks about the ability to generate accurate and complete copies in both human readable and electronic form suitable for inspection, review, and copying by the agency. One thing to note, of course, if it is electronic data, it needs to be maintained as electronic. You can't simply just print it and then delete all your electronic records. You can certainly print it if that's your procedure and stuff like that, but you still need to maintain those electronic records, unless it's a limitation of your system, in which case you would have validated and shown everything. But sometimes I think we've moved past that, but you know, those of you who've been around for a while, when we started moving towards electronic systems, most people just like, well, we print off a copy and we're good. And we're like, well, no, because there's a lot of metadata, a lot of stuff going on in the background that when you keystroke certain things in, it's linking, it's attesting to who made that entry and all that fun stuff. So just remember that.
And one more note, if you use cloud service, typically it's not your own, you have a vendor. And then the vendor qualification is something very important, vendor selection, qualification, oversight, making sure they test the retrieval from the backup. And typically also the cloud has their own backup, and the hosting provider and your cloud provider are not necessarily the same entities. You should know where they are located. So you want to know that your second backup is maybe on a server in China. And that's something that you don't want to happen. So be very careful and have a robust vendor qualification process and vendor oversight, and make sure that in your contract is the availability in case of inspection, that your cloud archiving provider guarantees that the documents will be available for the inspectors, say within 24 hours.
Great, thank you. Excellent points, Camilla. All right, let's get to question 3. An animal treatment log for a non-clinical toxicity study contains the following information: study number, group number, animal number, date of diagnosis, and description of diagnosis by the vet, and description and authorization of treatment. Treatment is to be given on an as-needed basis. The technician signs and dates whenever treatment is given. Is this acceptable? Select 1. A, no, there is no management review of the records. B, yes, acceptable. C, no, there is no documentation to indicate if animal was checked and treatment determined to be not needed on a given day. Or no, the vet cannot deem treatment as needed. All right. So we have a bunch of C's coming in. We've got a B. We have an I have no idea. Excellent. And you might, there are going to certainly questions that you're going to have no idea. Pin them to the side, move on, and then come back. And if you still don't know, just randomly guess. You don't get penalized for wrong answers. You obviously can't get a point if you have no answer.
And you may exclude things that you think immediately, okay, these are not the correct answers, and then perhaps you have 2 options. Well, 50-50, your guess is going to be right.
Absolutely. All right, so the C's have it. No, there is no documentation to indicate if animal was checked and treatment determined to be not needed on a given day. So treatment can be given if needed, but if you just document when you give treatment, how do you know that the someone else also potentially needed treatment and you forgot to give them treatment? You need that documentation to say that, yes, there's 20 animals on study. I checked all 20 and 2 of them needed treatment and we gave them treatment. So again, this is coming from 21 CFR Part 5890C. At the initiation of a non-clinical laboratory study, animal shall be free of any disease. I'll go to the highlighted part. These animals may be treated for disease or signs of disease, provided that such treatment does not interfere with the study. The diagnosis, authorization of treatment, description of treatment, and each date of treatment shall be documented and shall be retained. So that's part of it. And of course, while it's not strictly stated in the regulations, it's implied. If it's not documented, it's not done. So if you don't document that you've checked all the animals, then one can assume, well, prove to me that only 2 animals needed treatment and not all 20. Okay, so that's something to remember. All right, are there any questions on that one? All right, let's jump into question 4. All right, to avoid contamination, separate areas shall be maintained for, select 1, reagents and chemicals used for bioanalytical analysis, disposal of the test and control articles, automatic pipettes of various volumes, mixing of the test and control articles with a carrier.
And we have a lot of D's.
There's a lot of D's.
I noticed some
We've got a
B.
B.
I think Chris does that on purpose.
Yes.
You can see that.
Yeah, Chris is offering other potentials that may sound good, that can be arguably defendable. All right.
What's the conversation going?
Exactly. So the correct or the most correct answer is mixing of the test and control articles with a carrier. 21 CFR Part 5847, as necessary to prevent contamination of mix-ups. There shall be separate areas for receipt and storage of the test and control articles, mixing of the test and control articles with a carrier, e.g. feed, storage of the test and control article mixtures, storage areas for the test and or control article and test and control mixtures shall be separate from areas housing the test systems and shall be adequate to preserve the identity, strength, purity, and stability of the articles and mixtures. So that's the most correct, but typically most companies are going to have a designated area for disposal of the test and control articles, right? You're not just walking around and just dumping in any garbage or sink in your facility. It has to go to an appropriate place because, you know, we don't know what these things do. If you work under EPA, you don't want to just dump random chemicals or pesticides in our, in drinking water or whatnot. There's typically going to be a designated space for lab areas. So your pipette, separate areas for your pipettes and all your equipment, you're certainly going to have that. And reagents and chemicals used for bioanalytical analysis. Again, you need to have those typically separate from, your feed and stuff. You don't want potential dangerous reagents or chemicals by the feed that's going to go to animals. That's not a great thing. But again, it's looking for the most correct answer. So it's not necessarily frankly, none of those answers are wrong. It's looking again for the most correct because you can easily defend, well, of course, we're going to have a separate area for reagents and chemicals. We don't want, hazardous potential carcinogenic chemicals being, spilt on the animals or spilt in the feed or etc. So obviously all defendable, but there's only one most correct answer. All right. Does anybody have any questions on that one?
Just a comment. You may actually say that all of them are correct. And then if your lab does all of these things, you are certainly not doing bad. You are doing great, and it's helping you practically a lot.
Absolutely.
That's what makes the test difficult. It's like, well, all 4 of them are right. Which one do they want? So I think what Sherry says is absolutely correct. Just go based on what regulations specifically talk about. So and that's the most correct one.
Exactly. And think of like if you're unsure, because technically there should be designated areas for most of these things. Think of if there wasn't and there was a contamination or mix up, which would impact your GLP study the most. Obviously, if your test and control articles weren't separate and got mixed up, your study, like if you have test material in your control group, your study is, you don't have a real study anymore, right? You've lost your control group. So that is probably the most critical, right? Everything else, pipette's okay. Well, you can always repipette, or disposal area. Well, it's not the most appropriate, but in theory, unless you're pouring it into feed or animals, you know, so think of it that way. If you're not sure, what would be the, if they're all compliant answers, what would make the most sense? What's the most critical? All right, and our final quiz sample question. An auditor finds rats that have just been brought in from the supplier in the same room as rats currently on study. What is the issue with this scenario? Select one. Dosing of the test system, quarantine of test system, cleanliness of facility, identification of the test system.
And we have a lot of these.
Mm-hmm.
Any other opinion than B?
Oops, sorry. I jumped real quick. All right, so the answer is B. Great job, everyone. So 21 CFR 5890 for the correct answer. 5890 in animal care says all newly received animals from outside sources shall be isolated and their health status shall be evaluated in accordance with acceptable veterinary medical practice. So B would be the most important. And so that, again, dosing of test system, all of those are potentially defendable responses, like dosing of test system. So, you know, who's to say that the animals weren't evaluated in the receipt area and deemed okay and brought to the room? So maybe they are okay. And the dosing or the identification of the test system, perhaps they all have hand identified tattoo numbers and they were all inadvertently given the same animal ID as animals already in the room. So your 1001, there might be 2 of them, or there might be 3 of them. How would you inadvertently, you know, potentially misdose an animal? So these are defendable responses, but quarantine is the most because it doesn't say that they have been evaluated already. So go through your process. So an animal comes in, what's the first thing you have to do? You have to make sure that they're isolated and checked on the health status before you introduce them to the study or other animals, etc. Because if they come in and they have some sort of disease, they're brought into your animal room, something could get transferred, and then all of a sudden your study's at risk and animals are starting to show signs of, you know, which may look treatment related, but in fact, it's just been transferred from animals that came in not in a good health. So again, read your question, read through the answers, and pick out the most critical, most compliant answer. All right. So that was the last of our quiz test questions. Does anybody have any other questions, either about any of these things or any of the topics that that this session was on? I can jump back again to show you some of the topics. So test material information, test system, specimen sample, labeling, handling, etc. Reagent, supply, shipping, receiving, handling, storage, and disposition. Adherence to procedures as per the protocol, SOPs, and company policies. Data collection processes and data integrity. equipment maintenance, calibration, validation, archive of test article, facility and study materials, including disaster recovery and the appropriateness of raw data, and laboratory facility and or site activities that support GLP studies. So will exam questions be worded similar to the practice questions? Yes, they will. This particular session had somewhat easier ones. There are, in some of our other sessions, you'll, if you attend all of them or subsequently watch them, you will see that there are some that are a little bit trickier. And there are a couple that, you know, it has the question, it lists 4 or 5 options, and then it's the right combination. So it's a, you know, 1, 2, and 5, 1, 2, and 4, 2, 3, and 5, 2, 4, and 5. And then you're like, oh, okay, I know it's 5, so that eliminates this one. So now I'm left with these 3. Is there a clear difference on how the words monitoring versus inspecting versus auditing are defined? I know the words are sometimes used interchangeably. They are not, I would say, not specifically. Not specifically in the regulations themselves, in the guidance. So I brought you back to the SQA page with the RQA material. There is your compliance assessment. So there's information, and then it explains what monitoring is, what inspecting is, what auditing is. So it does define what those 3 are. And so we did compliance management. So the scheduling, reporting, and documenting, that was all more just mostly focusing on QA specific activities, which I think most people working in QA are well versed in. But yeah, so and those were all lumped in one, but then everything else. So definitely, if you're looking at writing the exam, whether you're doing it this session or future, definitely take a look at this. And this will help drive some of that information in terms of terminology that's used.
I'm watching the discussion in the chat.
Yeah.
And it's not necessarily correct. Inspecting is not only by an external regulatory authority. So just, yes, it is, but it's not only. Maybe, Sherry, if you can enlarge it a little bit, because it's maybe difficult to read. For me, it definitely is.
There we go. Okay, so.
Yeah. So if you read it, then you see.
Okay, so monitoring is the direct
definition.
observation, testing, and assessment of in-process activities and personnel for independent evaluation of compliance and the quality and integrity of the process. Inspecting is the critical appraisal by visual, olfactory, and tactile means of the capability, adequacy, and or current performance of a physical entity for adherence to established regulatory standards. And
we will
auditing.
go through it in a separate section, and then you will say, okay, olfactory, and you talk about protocol. Is it smelly or is it not? It sounds a little bit weird. So be careful about the definitions. Read the definitions in the handbook. That's very practical, this kind of differentiation. And yes, you may say there are some gray zones or overlapping activities. But let's say if I put it in some kind of hierarchy, monitoring is for me a kind of routine activity that checks on by direct observations what is going on. Monitoring may be done by another person than QA, may be done by a third party, may be done by an appointed monitor. While inspecting and auditing, there should be a person qualified to do that in the first place. And second, again, there will be some overlapping areas. But say inspecting is I walk around. If I imagine doing an audit, my audit will be a combination of auditing and inspecting. I walk around and I see, is the area clean or is it not clean? This is supposed to be logged. I try. Is it locked or not? And I do it all the time, and sometimes the lock is worn out and the bursts open, although the person swears I locked that. This is really trying the way, and auditing is more related to review of documentation in terms of the documentation completeness, RQAP principles, the overall quality and integrity, correctness, and so on. So for the protocol, if I do an inspection, which myself, I have a kind of question mark, what does it really mean? But I would check, okay, is it available at the point of use? Are people who are supposed to be familiar with it, are they familiar with it? Can I verify that just by going around and watching what they do? Not necessarily asking or reviewing their training record. And training record is a questionable value sometimes. I'm right now I am doing a remote audit, and I get something like 15 people, and for them, training transcript that tells me the topic, the say the date of the issuance of the document or the activity, and status, completion, and of course the person who the record belongs to. Basically, that's it. And each person has dozens of pages. So I would be reviewing like hundreds, if not thousands of pages. And it makes no sense to me. And I was writing to the QA director saying, do you have any better report that would show me, one, the compliance status in terms of percentages, completed in due time, completed overdue, ideally with a graph per person. And then something like overdue, okay, how long? Is it 1 day or whether 2 months? This makes much more value to me to review, are these people duly trained, on time and compliant, than reviewing neat, nice records that all say in the column status complete. I don't really read them because it has no real value. It does not tell me anything what I need to know as an auditor. So I happily skip all this. So also using common sense in terms of, does it make sense what I see? Is it logical? Or is there something essentially wrong? Is the version correct? If sometimes the version may change, there might be an amendment, and that's one of the exam questions. It talks about a potential amendment and so on. So using common sense, using basic logic, and thinking about the process and the purpose and the risk of the process. That would be a driving force that will be guiding you. And if you mix up monitoring, auditing, and inspecting, I don't think it's a big deal. The exam is not asking you about the difference. The exam is giving you the situation and asking you what is the most correct answer in this or that. That's that.
Yeah.
Sorry for taking
just,
so much
just
time.
no, that's okay. Thank you. Thanks, Camilla. It's just that OECD document number 23 actually has quoted specifically that some GLP monitoring, compliance monitoring authorities, they use the term audit for internal quality assurance inspections. And, inspection words specifically for the verification to be conducted by the compliance monitoring authority. It has been quoted in OECD document number 23. That's how I got to remember that. So, but it definitely says by some GLP monitoring authority. It's not across, universal something, but just a point of view because it has been quoted in the OECD document. So I put my point of view.
Excellent.
Good point, Jyoti. Thank you.
Thank you. Just to
you're
get to some of the other questions. So will we be reviewing any calculation questions in any of these sessions? No, so you won't require like pencil, paper, and eraser and calculator to do complex math. I'm not saying that there won't be very simple basic math. Maybe one, maybe two questions, like, if if your concentration as 5 mg per ml and your dose volume is 2,000 per animal, are you reaching the correct protocol? It'll be, if there's a calculation, it'll be very, very simple calculation. It's not a big math quiz, so don't have to worry about that. Thank you, Jody, for elaborating where you got those terms. Keep in mind that the exam, while it does include OECD, for the most part, the default will be the FDA approach or the EPA approach. Again, don't forget Society of Quality Assurance. While we are a global membership, it is a US-based organization. It started primarily in the US. So we welcome all of the OECD folks, and I can say that because I'm Canadian, so I'm OECD myself. But but yes, primarily the default will be FDA or EPA. If it is OECD specific, if they're looking for one of those nuanced OECD things, it will be clear in the question. And again, if you see, I don't remember which session it is, but there were a couple in the 30 test ones that did have in OECD, you're observing. Like, so there may be questions about multi-site, and then obviously multi-site, while that happens in the US, the guidance really is more coming from the OECD side. So that's the type of thing to make sure. How many questions? So while Camilla was talking, I saw someone, Taylor already posted that, but it is 165 questions, 15 of which are not actually scored. So it's 150. So I was correct initially when I said 150. So it's 165 questions, but 15 of them are not counted. They're test questions because the exam does get updated periodically. Like if a question is not testing well after a couple, they monitor that and they'll pull out a question if it's not testing well and throw in one that's testing better. So they're continually adding in some and pulling some out. But generally, the core of it is are questions that have been probably around since I first wrote. So, and you get 3.5 hours to complete the exam. So aim for getting through about 50 questions, 55 questions in an hour. So you're only getting about 1 minute per question. So that's why we say don't hold yourself up 5-10 minutes on one question, because that's just one little point and you potentially might run out of time at the end. So aim for about 50 to 55, and then you'll still have a bit of time to go back and touch on those ones that you just said. and it's the same as a question could be fairly simple, but sometimes you will see there's kind of like a big write-up about it. If you're starting to run tight on time, just jump it. If it's going to take you about 2 minutes to read through the whole question and then really make sure you understood that, and you're now 3-4 minutes and you're like, oh my God, I still haven't even looked at, like, really just jump on it. Come back to it later. Time yourself appropriately. Like you'll have lots of information about the time that you're, it's not just like you're writing and all of a sudden they're like 5 minutes left and you're like, what? So they do think you do get posted and updated about that. Yep, exactly. Per ton. All right, perfect.
Any content on method validation and the master schedule?
Yes. So we actually last session, there was a question on master schedule. So there, again, it's not, it was fairly straightforward. It was one of those explicit to FDA. And it asked in terms of how should your master schedule be pulled. And under the FDA GLPs, it should be pulled by test material, not study number or whatever. Under OECD, it's less specific, but under FDA, the expectation is test article, based on test article. Method validation, yes. I'm trying to remember if there's certainly a question in one of the sessions that talks about validation, expectations of, do you have to validate, or examples of, method wasn't validated or stuff like that. So absolutely, validation will be maybe, I can't say will be, I don't know, I don't remember the 165 questions, but validation is a topic that could be covered as well. Any questions specific to EPA GLPs? Is there a balance? So great question. Primarily, the core of it will be FDA GLPs. There will be some EPA and OECD, generally for the ones that are specific to the subtle nuances of OECD, because FDA, EPA, and OECD, the core of it is equivalent. The main content, they're all very similar. EPA and OECD base their rules on the FDA one, so they're not drastically different. If there's something that's looking for a nuance specifically of EPA or OECD, it will be clear in the question. But if you saw, let me lower this, one of our questions, so here in terms of the transfer method, the response came from actually EPA. It wasn't EPA specific, but the most clearly definition came from EPA, but this isn't something that's necessarily EPA. Thank you. Thank you, AWEG Wagers, for posting. There is a comparison chart of FDA, EPA. Is that just the two of them, or no, that's all three. So that's a super great document to have. And because it just highlights for the majority of it, other than potentially terms, the biggest differences that you will see is that most of the information is pretty much similar, or the requirements are similar, but under OECD versus FDA primarily, there's different responsibilities. Like OECD will be very specific that test facility management is responsible for this. FDA still has that requirement, but it doesn't stipulate who specifically is required to ensure that that functionality is done. So that tends to be one of the bigger ones. But overall, not huge differences, but certainly know that. And that comparison chart, thank you so much for posting that in that. I'll actually send that on as well to Lydia to post that actually in the group, so you can access that through SQA Connect as well afterwards. Do you know when we will find out that applications are accepted? We are eligible to take the exam, looking to schedule exam at a test center for April. Oh, thank you, Lydia. If you applied by the deadline, all applicants will be notified by mid-March, the latest. And someone was already notified last week, so it shouldn't be much longer. All right. With that, so we ran a little bit late, which is great. I was always worried. I'm like, are we gonna, like, after 20 minutes going, hello? These are great questions. Hopefully the session was very, very helpful. Thanks to all who asked the questions. Thank you, of course, to our wonderful subject matter experts, Anita and Camilla. Super much appreciated for everything. And thank you all for participating. And hopefully we'll see you next week.